Thank you so very much. It's an extraordinary honor for me to be speaking here this evening. And I very much appreciate all of your willingness to come out in spite of the dire warnings of weather disaster. And I've decided maybe I should name my memoir, Go See the Lego Movie instead. I thought I would begin with a commemoration of 3 heroes from the city of Philadelphia. We have Walker Hancock on the left. We have Captain Calvin Hathaway on the right. He was a curator of arts at the Museum of Art in Philadelphia, and he was one of the people who helped find one of the Nazi treasure troves near Kitzbühel, Austria. And in the middle, we have a gentleman named Langdon Warner who did not serve in uniform, but who in fact was a very critical advisor to the U.S. military when they were making decisions concerning the bombing and occupation of Japan at the end of the war. And due to his intervention, the cities of Kyoto, Nara, and Kamakura were saved. So how do we begin to learn about the Monuments Men, especially how does a lowly Army archaeologist from a remote northern outpost get that opportunity? And actually, I very much owe Dr. Brian Rose for that opportunity, because we were riding in an armored vehicle through the nether reaches of Iraq, and I said, have you ever heard of a place called the American Academy in Rome? and discovered that indeed he's one of the key board members and former fellows. And so Brian assisted me with my application, which I thought was an extraordinary long shot at the very best, and was quite amazed that they had even considered me for a jury interview, let alone the award. And I have some images of the Academy, and at that point I had no idea that the Academy had a tradition of supporting the military. And in fact, I went to the awards ceremony anticipating that I would be the first person in the history of the institution where the board would override the jury and say, no way, we're not going to take an Army person, are you kidding? And so I was quite shocked when I arrived, and they were still intending to offer me the prize. And I texted my husband and said, they didn't change their mind. And then my next great fear was that the other fellows would not want to associate with someone from the United States Army. And so I had visions of a year in Rome eating dinner all by myself. And at the awards ceremony, one of the young landscape architects started to quiz me a little bit about my work. And he said, so you've really been to Iraq? And I said, yes. And he said, have you really been to Afghanistan? And I said, yes. And he looked at me and he looked at the others and said, you're the coolest one of all of us. And I will always be in his debt. And that was my first hint that it would be the most extraordinary year of my life. And I began to realize that I was having the opportunity to walk in these extraordinary footsteps. And so Dr. Rose has mentioned Captain Keller, his extraordinary response after the bombing, which was an accident at Camposanto Pisa, where the lead roof then melted and destroyed the frescoes. He and a British officer put the tarps in place and began the recovery of the paintings. And he is actually honored by being buried there. The people of Pisa were anxious for him to return. We have Captain Ralph Hammett, who put together lists of all of the monuments throughout the entire country of France. And we have Mason Hammond, who served as the director of classical studies at the American Academy in Rome. And he was one of the first officers on the ground in Italy, first in Sicily and then in Naples. And we have Sidney Beeler in the bottom corner, who has saved Italian art under fire, winning the Knight of the Crown of Italy, the Silver Star, the Bronze Star, and the Croix de Guerre. He also designed the memorial figures at the American Cemetery in Florence. And for any of you, if you have not had the privilege of visiting the foreign military cemeteries, I can tell you that the cemetery in Florence is one of the most moving landscapes I have ever had the privilege to encounter, and his monuments are remarkable. And we have two additional figures. Again, another hero from who has once worked in Philadelphia right here at the museum. At that time, he was Lieutenant Frederick Hart. And you can see he has something of a sense of humor as he balances that sculpture on the hood of his Jeep. And most of the lessons learned that I'll be discussing with you tonight, I learned from his first-hand account of Florentine art under fire, which fortunately for me was in the library at the Academy. And we also have Lieutenant Colonel Ernest DeWald, who again fortunately left behind many of his papers to form an archive. And when I first labeled this picture, I put Lieutenant Colonel DeWald Archives of the American Academy in Rome, and then realized that it was giving the impression that the Academy is hosting the crown jewels, when in fact, the point I wanted to make was that his archives are there. But this is an image of him during the recovery of the crown jewels of the homely Roman emperor. So in case anyone had any doubts about the significance of the work in recovery, it would be dissuaded by just this one image alone. So where do the lessons begin? And my process and growth as I began to understand the relationship between heritage and military strategy began with the news stories of the damage at Babylon. And I was on my way to work, and I heard about the damage on National Public Radio, and it's a 40-minute drive, so by the time I got to the office, I was prepared to pull my staff together and say, we are redirecting our program. Yes, the archaeology of Fort Drum is very important. My own personal archaeological specialty is Native Americans of the Great Lakes, because my primary responsibility is heritage and preservation of our archaeology at the installation and a small historic district with a mansion that dates to 1826 and a handful of outbuildings and historic landscape there. We have Native American material dating back to the melting of the glaciers. Our earliest sites date back 10,000 years, with continuous indigenous occupation right on through to the expansion of the fort in World War II. But we realized that we were deploying our young men and women to one of the most archaeologically rich places in the world, and we had not prepared them. And the damage at Babylon was the result. What's the strategic value? There are multiple levels of consequences when U.S. forces make these kinds of mistakes. One is the propaganda value of failing to respect heritage. And I'll be discussing that in more detail, but I'll preface, too, that we also have the concern of the immediate art under fire. And so the very first time I got in front of a group of 10th Mountain soldiers, having Googled ziggurat and various other ways of informing myself about what I might be talking about, I showed them a picture of a Middle Eastern cemetery that I'd gotten off the internet. And I said to the young soldiers, sometimes, even if a cemetery is abandoned, it's still important, and you need to show respect. And a soldier raised his hand, he said, ma'am, that's not an abandoned cemetery. That's a shot-up cemetery. And another soldier said, so ma'am, is it okay to shoot back when they're shooting at us from the cemeteries? And I was so startled, I uttered an expletive and said, blank, yes. And another soldier said, ma'am, you're our kind of archaeologist. But the point it drove home was that this wasn't just about, oh, let's be careful, and we need to be prepared, because if our young men and women hesitate over this issue, they will be killed. And our adversaries take advantage of those opportunities, unfortunately, all too often. Then you have the propaganda issue. And what I learned is that during World War II, the ancient city of Cyrene on the Mediterranean coast of Libya changed hands. It was in Italian hands, then it was in British hands, then it went back to Italian hands. When the Italians regained that location, they published this pamphlet. What did the English do in Cyrene? And the pamphlet then had incendiary photos. This one is taken from Lynn Nicholas's book, The Rape of Europa. And it shows an empty exhibit hall. They're implying the that the British stole the objects. Other pages had pictures of broken statues. Well, any of you that have visited an ancient site from antiquity are going to know they're filled with broken statues. But the Italians were hoping to make the case, and remember that the British and the Allies are about to enter the mainland of Italy, that the British and the Allies had no respect for ancient Roman culture, and they showed it by this. And in fact, the pamphlet was faked, but Leonard Woolley recognized that it was a huge propaganda issue and would need to be addressed. And he began to do courses for Allied soldiers on archaeological sites, beginning to teach about the importance of the issue. In 2009, we decided to do the very same thing at the Bright Star War Games in Egypt. And and again, the propaganda value is illustrated by the fact that when we went to make the arrangements for access to the pyramid fields to take and educate American soldiers, the Egyptian military officers responded at first by saying, "Are you kidding? The last people we want near our pyramids are, quote, the destroyers of Babylon," referring to the Americans. So word of that damage had spread throughout the Middle Eastern militaries, and they felt that it was a huge gesture of either ignorance or lack of respect. In fact, we then bypassed the Egyptian military officers and went straight to Zahi Hawass, who actually recognized that it was a really pretty good idea and ended up hosting us. We didn't have to buy tickets. He gave us a special guide, and we were able to take this group of folks out to actually talk about the importance of respecting heritage in the host nation context. At that time, it was before my fellowship in Rome, I had no idea that Leonard Woolley had already had this great idea. I gave several talks telling people that I was the very first person to organize an archaeology awareness training. But in fact, again, I was following in extraordinary footsteps. And this is an image, not of Cyrene, but of what the landscape looked like around Tobruk to a lonely soldier back in the deserts of Africa at that time. I couldn't find an image of an actual training, but I did find this wonderful image of Mason Hammond working with the soldiers. And I think that Professor Rose would agree heartily with me that the opportunity to work with eager military personnel, whether you're on or off an archaeological site or have the privilege of being in a museum or in an ordinary classroom, is one of the most rewarding experiences that we have ever had during the course of our careers. I'd like to read to you an email I received from a young soldier serving in Iraq in 2007 after he had received some of our archaeology awareness playing cards. Dr. Rush, I had no idea of the deep history here until I first arrived in country. I think your program will do great with the troops, since most of them seem very interested, but they were never presented with this type of information before mobilizing. I noticed that the local population is very proud of their ancient heritage, and the protection of ancient sites and relics could provide some common ground. Note the term, common ground, between U.S. forces and patriotic Iraqis. And these are examples of soldier materials, again, that preceded me by 60 years. And during the course, as things were settling down, there was a major effort to educate the soldiers about the antiquity and culture of the host nations, in this case, Europe. And here's an image of Dr. Rose, in fact, and the Penn Museum has hosted multiple visits from military personnel preparing to go to Iraq. And one of the things that I think is wonderful about it is the willingness to let them be up close with extraordinary valuable objects. And that's a thrilling experience for the uninitiated, I guess we could say. Lesson 2. Heritage matters. The United States is a very young country, and this audience, given the fact that you've chosen to be here tonight, is probably an exception, but on the average, it's very difficult for an ordinary Americans to have a sense of what it's like to live on the land that your ancestors have been living on for thousands of years. Those people's relationship and their sense of place is not the same. It's far more intense, and those ties are very, very deep. We could think about our ties to perhaps a family farm or a special place or where we were born and grew up, but it just can't be the same. Our indigenous people have those ties to the ancient places in North America, but the European and other immigrants from around the world to this continent don't share that relationship. And so when we go to the ancient places as a military, we encounter people who have put their lives on the line, risked their lives over and over again to save their heritage. And there are people who are doing that to this very day. We have examples here. This is Sheikh Al-Tubi. His family has been protecting the ancient city of Uruk with financial support from the Germans since the beginning of the Iraq conflict. This is Abdul-Amir Hamdani. He actually was jailed by Saddam sympathizers when he went out to try to control looting in and around the ancient city of Ur. Here's the ziggurat that was returned in excellent condition to the Iraqi people under the stewardship of Abdul-Amir in 2009. And then we have the heroes of the Afghan National Museum. These are the key holders who kept the location of the most valuable objects in the collection a secret throughout the Russian and Taliban occupation of their country, even when they were seriously threatened with torture. And as a result, there is now an exhibition that has been touring the world of the treasures of the National Museum. And one of the museum mottos is, "A nation stays alive when its culture stays alive," and that stone is found outside of the gate. And one way that I learned a little bit more about these relationships was during the spring festival at Sardis. And the first weekend in May, and this is in Turkey, about an hour east of the Mediterranean coast, all of the Turkish families, like about 30,000 people, head up into the valley for a spring festival. And as one of two European women who decided to go that day, we joined them, and we ended up at the Temple of Artemis. And young Turkish children like to approach people from the West and practice their language skills. And so a little girl came up to us and introduced herself and told us her name and asked us our names. And when we finished that conversation, fortunately, Dr. Christina Luke, who was with me, began to speak to her in Turkish. And she began to ask her about the festival. And she said, "Are you here for the games? Are you here for the market?" And the little girl said, "Yes, all those things, but we are here to be in the very old places." And all of a sudden, Christina and I realized that we had joined the Ancient Rites of Artemis. It's a spring festival celebrating fertility and young women. And it's been going on ever since they built this temple in early May. And those are the kinds of ties that we need to be thinking about. And again, examples over and over of extraordinary efforts. The Italians built incredible edifices to protect their monuments. This is actually a brick structure completely encasing the Pillar of Trajan in the Forum at Rome. Here's another sandbag and scaffolding of an arch of Trajan in Benevento. And a very, very similar structure is what saved the Cenacolo, the Da Vinci's Last Supper in Milan. I didn't realize until I had the privilege of visiting, along with the Italian art police, the Cenacolo, but that entire church was bombed, and everything fell down around that wall. But it is still there for us to appreciate because the Italian people sandbagged it and built a scaffolding so the wall stood with the painting on it while the rest of the building just crumbled. So extraordinary efforts. This is a picture of the Uffizi librarian as they're beginning to recover objects from the Germans. And below, in terms of talking about people who are still putting their lives on the line. We have the men and women who smuggled manuscripts out of Timbuktu to ensure their safety. They went by bicycle, they went by canoe, they went on foot, they went in food containers. And these people who saved these manuscripts in their homes in remote places throughout Mali put their lives and their families' lives on the line. Can you imagine if the Islamists found a food container in your house filled with manuscripts? Another lesson, objects and collections also matter. And my colleagues in the museum field always remind me, Laurie, we know you're an archaeologist, but don't forget to tell the soldiers about our museums. And it is a very, very important issue. And the lesson we learned from Lieutenant Hart is that when you're cleaning up rubble, whether it's a tsunami or an earthquake or any other kind of event, you've got to know where the museum was. Because in this case, it was the rubble of the Columbarius Society, one of the oldest libraries in Florence, Italy. The Germans had blown it up, and the British had decided that they needed to get that rubble out of the road. But when you have rubble of a museum, it is often filled with objects you can save. And so he and some other soldiers stopped the bulldozers, began to go through the rubble, and they saved thousands of manuscripts and volumes and incunabuli, and were able to begin to put that library back together. So from time to time, I have the privilege of briefing Air Force generals before they deploy. And they're busy learning Dari and Pashto and taking long courses, and I begin to talk a little bit about archaeology, and you can tell that maybe their minds are wandering. But then when I say disaster response, let's talk about disaster response, I have their full attention. Every Air Force general knows that no matter what their current assignment, they can be called upon to respond to a disaster. And this example of knowing where the libraries, museums, and other collections are located hits home, and that's a very fortunate thing. We have another example. This is the frescoes in Haiti. The church collapsed in the earthquake, but a couple of walls containing the frescoes of the first depiction of biblical characters as people of color ever in the world, and it was quite controversial, remained, and those frescoes were able to be saved because the team coming in from the Smithsonian recognized that that was salvageable and of extreme value. We also have an example. This is Pope Celestine V, the cathedral where his remains, and of course his remains now are considered to be a holy relic, the cathedral collapsed. But the people of Aquila, as they're beginning to stabilize, one of the first things they did was recover this sacred relic and make sure that he was back in the central location of the sacred space so they could begin to worship again in the manner to which they were accustomed. And sometimes it's all we have left. That's how that phrase translates. And you have people who are devastated, and in this case, it's an Italian village called Pieve Santo Stefano, and the Germans, when they were retreating, blew up every single building, just out of sheer malice. Everybody's house, all the stores, the marketplace, the church. Everything was destroyed. And the one item that miraculously was saved was a Della Robbia altarpiece. I don't have a photo of the Della Robbia altarpiece, although it is still in a place of honor in a brand new building in the tiny village. But in a similar situation in Belgium, this is the Madonna de la Glaise, which is also being carried to a safe place, and she also survived a horrendous attack by the Germans, and in this case, the monuments officers, just like Fred Hart, helped them save the Della Robbia. They're helping the Belgians here save their Madonna. And we have a colleague, Brigadier General Furstenhofer, he's now retired from the Austrian military. But early in his career, he and his team of Austrian soldiers responded to an earthquake in central Italy. And again, the village has been almost decimated. Most of the structures have crumbled. The Italian fire brigades were still pulling people out of the rubble, and there was no assignment for the Austrians. So Furstenhofer, as a young officer, took his men to the church, and they recovered all of the objects you needed for the sacrament, the chalice, the candlesticks, and various sacred items, and he brought them to the parish priest. And the priest said, called all the villagers together, held communion, and turned to the Austrians and said, for the first time since the disaster, we now have hope that we will survive, not as individuals, but as a community, that we will be back. Lesson 4. You've got to know where the objects are and what they are. You have to have a list. And in this case, and in fact, one of the fellows that was on the earlier slide was the one that made the list for France. But these are examples from the Academy archives of the actual list. And it was really quite exciting to be able to hold them in my hands. And we are doing the very same kind of effort today. Of course, we're using computerized databases, but the good news is that when you get these maps to the forward personnel, they will do everything they can to try and save these properties. And it begins with aerial operations and the no-strike list. So in the case of Libya, as soon as President Obama announced that the Americans were going to get involved, our colleagues Susan Kane and Andrew Wilson, a colleague from the UK, who were anticipating it, got their lists together, and the State Department, the Committee of the Blue Shield, cooperated, got the list to Defense Intelligence Agency, which got it to the NATO targeteers, and when Dr. Rose and I organized a conference in Rome in the fall of 2011, we had a Libyan archaeologist who had actually been on the scene and was able to announce that the list had worked. And not only had the major sites along the coast been spared, but actually one of the priority 2, which is quite, the second string of properties, had been saved. It was a Roman fortress called Ras al-Maghrib. Gaddafi, and again, we find the bad guys like to put their military bases and tactical equipment in direct association with cultural property because it does make decent forces reluctant to attack. So he had put his radar right on top of the Roman fortification, and the NATO high technology, accurate gunnery was able to take the radar out and leave the fortress intact. Precision ammunitions. But how do you figure out what should be on the list? Everybody agrees, all of the World Heritage Sites, yeah, no problem. They've got to be on the list. We also have U.S. domestic legislation that says that we should respect other people's national lists, anything that would be the equivalent of our National Register of Historic Places. But does anybody in the audience know what this pointy rock is all about? This is the horn of the dragon slain by Hazrat Ali, the founding hero of the Hazara people in the Bamiyan Valley. When I use the horn of the dragon when I'm talking to young soldiers, I say, would you like to be in charge of the unit where the private backed into the horn of the dragon? And generally, they don't want to be in that situation, do they? Everyone, and I had actually a Hazara gentleman in an audience in Bloomington last summer. He knew immediately what it was. It doesn't have a sign, it doesn't have a fence, but everyone in the Hazara Valley knows that it's the horn of the dragon. So one of the critical skills now is not just trying to figure out what matters at the local level, because that might be the level where our young ladies and gentlemen can get themselves killed, but it's also reading the landscape. What looks like it doesn't fit? How do we develop those skills and look for the clues that people leave behind? Perhaps from time to time people leave offerings at the Horn of the Dragon. I don't know, but that would be the type of clue that we're trying to use our awareness training to inculcate. And we also have definitions. These are actually part of an outdoor art exhibition that I found along the Trastevere. It was fabric art, and it had these delightful socks, but it shows the incredible range and the challenge. And I can tell you that trying to get people to agree about what should be on the list is not an easy task. You need rules and processes, certainly working for the military. And I feel there's a certain connection because before I decided to change the title of my memoir, I thought it would be Round Peg in a Square Hole, because I think of myself as a free-thinking anthropologist trying to function in military culture. And I've used every anthropological skill I ever learned to figure out military culture, how to fit, how to behave, and be effective. And they like rules, and they like processes, and they will often respond by saying, just tell us how to do it. If you tell me what you need us to do and you tell us how to do it, we will do our very best. So you see that all of our monuments officers had definitely figured that out, and they made the rule book. Here is what you need to do in order to protect these objects. And we have a modern version now, and we are just in the process of revising it yet again, so we'll have our 2014 edition. But the one where what we say in the military, the rubber hits the road, it's this boring typed one. This is Central Command Regulation 200-2, and it was put forward by my colleague and friend, St. Lieutenant Colonel Ranger Dan Brewer of U.S. Central Command, the leading environmental engineer, and he was the one that said, if we make a rule book and we get the Chief of Staff to sign it, then you will be able to go to the forward officers and say, ladies and gentlemen, you have to protect this property. And in fact, it got signed in 2008, and not long after, we had a young sergeant who was an art historian who saw a backhoe excavating archaeological material to make an earthen fence, and he was able to take a copy of 200-2 to his commanding officer that I had just happened to email to him and said, sir, we can't dig this here, and I will show you the good results in a moment. We also, again, another example of Saddam Hussein putting his base on the top of an archaeological site. And every time a shovel went in the ground in Kirkuk, we had a Captain Calloway who was trying to handle the multitudes of artifacts that were spilling out of the ground. And again, in terms of looking for the shared interest, this aircraft radar control, air traffic control radar, was delayed in terms of being able to be put into operation because every time they tried to dig the fence into the tell, artifacts appeared. So when you talk to the Air Force officers, and I don't know about you, but if I flew into Kirkuk, I would want operating aircraft to control radar. Then you want to be sure that you are equipped to deal with these archaeological problems. Plus, having been a base, Saddam had buried previous soldiers there. So showing respect, again, is a very critical necessity. And we did, fortunately, have an archaeologist in uniform, Airman Daryl Pinkney, who then added being the base cultural resources manager to his other tasks as his tour of duty in Kirkuk. And this is one of the management maps that he made as he was pointing out areas of greater and lesser, although the whole place really is a site. And we've talked about archaeology, we've talked about collections, and we also have sacred places and features that are not bricks and mortar. And again, Lieutenant Hart discusses, after the Germans blew up all the bridges across the Po River, the Allies needed to rebuild the bridges so the forces could keep moving. So the British went to the sacred forest of Camaldoli, and because it was sacred, it was filled with virgin forests, nice big trees, great for building bridges. And as they began to cut down the sacred forest, the Italian community was up in arms. And Lieutenant Hart intervened, stopped the destruction of the sacred forest, found them alternative sources for rebuilding the bridges, and the problem was solved, and a real disaster averted on multiple levels. We have encountered very similar situations in our modern conflicts. When you have a sniper in a grove of date palms, one relatively easy way to solve it is cut them all down. And if you do that, you run the risk of infuriating an entire Iraqi village and a whole series of extended families who've been handing that grove on for generations. We also found, and this is actually a 10th Mountain Division example, that the Taliban began to deliberately take the fight to the pomegranate orchards. And not only was it a way to try to tempt the Americans to damage those assets, but they also had figured out how to convince the local people to present us with really hefty bills for orchard damage. We also always have to remember the mission. In this case, this is a fortification constructed by the forces of Genghis Khan in the 13th century. It has been continuously occupied as a fortification by forces moving through Afghanistan. And the most recent force that was using this fortification was the Taliban. And it was important to get them dislocated from this part of Helmand province. Is that a military target? Absolutely. Is it incredibly historic? Absolutely. So under every treaty, every example of military law, if you need to take a piece of heavy equipment through the mud brick wall, that's what you need to do. That's an actual photo of the taking of Kandashin. But afterwards, where we can do better is minimizing any further damage as we take responsibility for that asset. The palaces of Saddam Hussein presented a huge challenge in this regard. And a big problem with handling the palaces is that initially they were viewed as the private property of a criminal, as opposed to public places that perhaps belonged to the Iraqi people. And the challenge began to come home when it was time to give the palaces back to representatives of the new Iraqi government. And you had things like a little basketball hoop that had been installed in the ballroom, or vandalized artwork that soldiers thought was funny enough to put on the internet, where I found this example. And we have the case of playing hockey on the marble floors that probably doesn't do a whole lot of damage. But what I did discover when I was giving a presentation to the Society of American Military Engineers at Fort Drum is that they had donated the hockey equipment. And they were really embarrassed. But we, again, have outstanding examples. This is a Villareale Poggioacano, and again, a Lieutenant Hart arrives. It's clearly an important historic villa. It was actually being used to store art that had been evacuated out of Florence and was being hidden from the Germans. The Germans had been through and helped themselves to 58 cases of artwork. Nevertheless, there was still plenty of art stored there. It had inlaid floored, frescoed walls, every attribute you can imagine for a fabulous Italian villa. What it also had was 197 wounded, bleeding South African soldiers. Did Fred Hart say, oh, take those guys out in the rain, this is really an important villa? Absolutely not. What he did was meet with the commanding officer and move forward with very simple steps for preserving the attributes of the villa. He said, do you mind if we move all this art into the attic and lock the door? Can we put some carpets down on the inlaid floors? Please stay back from the frescoed walls. And as a result, it was able to be used as a hospital temporarily with a minimum of damage. And we have a really great example. I am so proud of these Marines. Look at how nice and neat. They're behaving in the museum. There's no graffiti. No statues have been knocked over. And I was able to confirm that they really were extremely respectful when they bedded down in the museum in Nasiriyah, because the Italian Carabinieri, my other heroes, were the next ones in, and they said that the people of Nasiriyah were frightened of people in uniform because Marines are very scary, but that the Marines had been very respectful and done no damage at all during the course of staying at the museum. And again, I view the role of the modern military archaeologist as providing the tools and skills and ideas that do make it possible for being in a place like Kandashin, making folks comfortable, but doing a minimum of damage. Can you put up a temporary fence? Can you mark the places that you don't want people to go? And also informing a combat commander ladies and gentlemen, this place, an archaeological site where you need to be, and remember, a defensive position 6,000 years ago, 1,000 years ago, is a good defensive position today. But if folks have been there before, perhaps there's cisterns, perhaps there's tunnels. And in Afghanistan, there were the ancient Crees water systems. So if you're not aware of all of the underground infrastructure in an ancient archaeological site, your secure perimeter might not be as secure as you would like to think it is. So at Fort Drum, we have 5 villages that were wiped out during the expansion of the base to meet the training needs of World War II. We had over 360 families who lost their farms in the countryside, and all of the villagers who lost their homes. These village remains now are archaeological properties. So we have the historic village of Sterlingville. It was a little iron town where they had a big iron furnace and made pig iron. And it's at the crossroads of a critical training area. And what we did is we took all the old foundations, we filled in the wells, and we made it a You Can Train Here archaeological site. So, not as we speak, because it's a little snowy there right now, but during our training seasons, on the average about 7,000 to 10,000 soldiers a year get the opportunity to practice being in an archaeological site without doing damage. And what we need to remember is that, going back to our young soldier who reminded me of the common ground, heritage is a key for the future. I have examples here. This is an Orthodox church on one of the borders. It's on the Islamic edge of Serbia. I have an Islamic enclave which is within Serbia and is intact. And this, of course, is the city of Dubrovnik, which was shelled by the Croatians during the recent Balkan conflict. When UNESCO went to representatives of the former Yugoslavia and said, we would like to offer a course on heritage preservation, will you attend? It was the first time since this conflict where representatives of every single country of the former Yugoslavia agreed to get together in the same room on any issue. And by the end of the day, oops, oh, doggone it, I pressed the wrong button. By the end of the day, we had Croatians talking to Bosnians, thank you, Brian, about working together to teach their soldiers. And this gentleman is Lieutenant Colonel Hajim Hadjic. He is the Director of Education at the Peacekeeping Operations Training Center in Sarajevo. If you want to talk to somebody about heritage preservation, Lieutenant Colonel Hadjic watched his library burn in Sarajevo. You don't need to educate this soldier about this issue. And every single soldier now that enters the Bosnian military signs an oath as part of their oath of joining the military that they will never damage cultural property, even if ordered to by a superior. So this issue, once again, matters. And this bottom image is of a group of us at one of the Austrian-hosted military trainings. And again, you have people from Italy, Austria, Libya, Italy, Hungary, Poland, the Netherlands, and even a random American who are working together to think about how we can handle these issues. This is during the course of Lieutenant Colonel Brewer's command at Central Command. He arranged 9 opportunities for us to go to the Middle East to work on preservation issues. And this is an example where we went to talk with officers of the Jordanian military. And again, you really don't have to convince them because, again, they have those ties to their heritage. And one further example is the Iraqi Conservation Project. This is the Citadel, the city of Erbil, and the city donated a building where now there is a heritage training center where Iraqis from all over the country can come to learn the skills they need to go home to solve, preserve, either take care of their museum collections or preserve archaeological sites. And you find Sunnis, Shias, and Kurds in the same room working together. Oh, darn it. I did it again. Oh, wait, I figured it out. And so I guess the question to myself, and in reading about the monuments officers, is what do we want our legacy to be? So my personal legacy is this tiny archaeological site where I emailed the regulations to a young soldier. It was a site that doesn't even have a name, somewhere northeast of Baghdad. I hope it's still there, but I can tell you that it was still there when the Americans left because they stopped the digging and put up the signs. We also have a ceremonial place at Fort Drum where now the Iroquois people can bring their children to celebrate the ancient ceremonies and talk about the wisdom of the ancestors. So those are my tiny pieces that I hope will be my legacy. But there are just so many more important legacies out there, and one of them is Langdon Warner. The people of the communities he saved in Japan were so appreciative. They actually have a Langdon Warner Day that they celebrate annually. I think it's in the city of Nara. And these are monuments just to this one gentleman. And you can see his name. And the picture that I showed at the beginning is his image from the monument in Japan. So he's remembered and appreciated even now by these people. And I also appreciated this quote when George Stout was writing home about how did he feel about what he accomplished. And one time I was giving a talk at Yale, and a gentleman raised his hand and said, "I'm really sorry, Dr. Rush, you seem way too optimistic to be in such a field that's so important and so and have such serious concern." And I thought about it, and I thought, well, it's that or run away from my desk screaming. What can we do? But I really felt that George Stout summed it up nicely in terms of that you need to think about those tiny victories, even if it is a site without a name, northeast of Baghdad, and thinking about what the job stands for. And with that, I will go to questions.